Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to show you how to gather, but I'm not just going to show you how to gather, I'm also going to do an experiment to see if 3 rows of gathering stitches really are better than 2. So I'm going to make one little miniature skirt with 2 rows of gather stitches and an identical one with 3. So let's get started and see how it goes. For this first piece I'm going to sew 3 rows of gathering stitches. So I've set my sewing machine to number 4, which is my largest stitch, and I'm just moving my needle over to make sure that it's on my 1/4 inch mark I've made. I don't know whether you can see, but there's a little pencil mark of 1/4 inch, and I'm making sure that it matches up with the gauge on my sewing machine, so I know I'm going to be sewing 1/4 inch if I follow the gauge on my sewing machine. And I continue to sew at 1/4 inch for the whole length of the fabric, and I do not back tack at the start nor the finish. It's very important that you don't back tack. If you do, you won't be able to pull your threads tight. What I forgot to say at the beginning was that you need to have long tail ends of cotton of your thread so that it's easier for you to pull it. So start off with a long tail end, and then when you get to the end, as I said, don't back tack. And when you pull your fabric away, make sure you leave long tail ends of thread. Now for the second row, I start 1/4 inch away from the first row, which will be 1/2 inch in from the edge. And again, no back tacking, straight into your stitching, and sew a nice straight line. Whatever you do, don't cross over the first line. If you do, you won't be able to pull your threads tight. So keep a nice straight line 1/4 inch away from the first line, and again, don't back tack when you get to the end, and make sure you leave yourself long tail ends of thread. And for the third row, I sew 1/4 inch away from the second row, which gives me 3/4 inch away from the edge. I have put marks right at the beginning, I don't know whether you can see, so I know where to start, and then I use the gauge on my foot plate to measure. Again, no back tacking at the start, so all the way down to the end in a nice straight line. Don't cross over your second or first line, but don't cross over your second line, otherwise, as I said before, you won't be able to pull your gathers tight. So keep going all the way to the end, just finish without back tacking, and again leave long tail ends. And that's how my 3 rows of stitching looks. Then I mark the centre of my piece of fabric, which worked out to be 9 inches because it was 18 inches long. So I put a mark in the centre so I can join my centre of my gathers up with the centre of my waistband or whatever I'm joining to. Next, you need to separate your top row of threads from your bottom row of threads. So you should have 3 on one side and 3 on the other, and you need to separate them because we're only going to pull from either the top or the bottom, not both. Next, we can start to pull up our gathers using either the top or the bottom set of threads from one side, or you can do like I do and do a little bit from each side. If the piece of fabric you're gathering is long, then you are best to pull a little bit from each side. So pull to the middle from one side and then go to the other side and pull from that side to the middle. So I'm just separating my threads from the other side because I did separate them, but they seem to have got tangled up again. So separate my front thread from my back threads, and then I can start to pull. Make sure you pull from either the top or the bottom on both sides when you're pulling. Don't try and pull from the bottom ones if you pull from the top ones the first time round. Next, we need to match up our gathered skirt with the waistband. I'm just marking the centre of my waistband, which was 9 inches, so 4.5 inches is the centre, and then I find the centre mark of my gathered skirt if I can, and then I'm going to join my skirt to the waistband, matching the centres and with right side spacing. So I've got the right side of the skirt facing the right side of my waistband, and then I'm going to gently even out my gathers all the way along, making sure that the skirt and the waistband are the same length, and then I pin them together at the end. and then I pin all the way along side of the fabric where I have my gathers. So it's actually the wrong side of the fabric, making sure that I pin on the that's where I want my pins. So I pin on the side where I have my gathers because that's the side we're going to sew. So again, just making sure that the gathers are nice and even, and then I pin all the way along. And I do the same on the other side. I match up the end, make sure that my gathers and my waistband are the same length, put a pin in at the end, and then continue to pin from the middle to the end. To sew my skirt to the waistband, I changed the colour of my thread because I want it to match this time rather than be a contrasting colour, so we don't want to see it. So I changed from blue to cream to match the fabric. Next, I sew my waistband to my gathered skirt, and I'm going to use on this one a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which means that I'll be sewing between the second and the third row of my gather stitches. I start by back tacking, and then I very carefully sew, removing the pins as I go along. I missed that one. Anyway, removing the pins as I go along, taking my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, removing the pins as I go, and as I said, I back tack at the start now and the finish, and of course I've altered my stitch size back to 2.5, which is what I would normally use from the 4 that I had for the gathers. Not sure if you can see my row of stitching here. It's a little bit difficult to see as it's the same colour as the fabric, but it does go between the second and the third row of your gathered stitches. Now you can trim off all those loose threads. So trim the loose threads, and then we're going to unpick that third row of gathering stitches. Now if you want, you can unpick all of them, and I probably would if I was actually making this into a dress or something, but it's just for an experiment, so I'm just going to unpick the third row, which you can see on the right side of the fabric. And then I give a quick iron, but I'm very careful not to squash any of my gathers I've put in. So I iron from the bottom of the skirt up to the gathers, and then when I do the waistband, I go from the top of the waistband down, trying not to crush any of my gathers I've just put in. For the second piece of gathering, I'm going to run through this very quickly because we're doing exactly the same as with the first. The only difference is that we do 2 rows of gather stitches at 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 an inch. So again, 1/4 of an inch apart, but we're just doing 2, not 3, just so we can see which one works out the best, if any. So exactly as before, I mark the centre on both the gathered fabric and the waistband, and I gather using either the top or bottom threads, pin it to the waistband in exactly the same way, and I change back to the cream thread because I no longer need a contrasting colour, I want it to match, and then I sew, removing my pins as I go, again taking a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. However, this time it goes below both of the 2 rows of gathering stitches. And don't forget to back tack at the start and the finish. So here are my 2 finished little skirt panels. Let me see if I can tell you which is which by looking at them. Yes, this is the one with 3 rows. This is the one with 2 rows. There is a difference, but I think that this is totally acceptable with 2 rows. But this is even better with 3 rows, definitely. You get a lot more tiny little gathers that you don't get on this one. I'm going to show you a close-up so you can see for yourself the difference. Can you tell which one has the 3 rows of gathers? Is it the top one or the bottom one? It was the bottom one. And my theory is that if you do like me and take a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you end up sewing in between 2 rows of gathering stitches. So your stitches here, and this third row, which isn't here anymore because I removed it, but this third row of gathering stitches holds the gathers in place, and you sew in between 2 rows of gathering stitches. So it's holding those gathers in place so they don't get squashed out so much as when you only do 2 and you sew down here, and there's nothing to hold these gathers in place. Anyway, I do hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, could you please like and subscribe to help my channel grow? Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.